So my topic is trauma-informed teaching in the music classroom. I want to spend a little bit on why I chose this topic because I think it shows how relevant this is to music education. My first point up here is called TTS Violin Student Email. So I teach in a program called Through the Staff. It's basically for, yeah, I know Melisa teaches through it too, and I think Lauren Culver also teaches. She's not here today, but she's taught through it too, and it's basically for college students that want to get teaching experience, and you volunteer and teach private lessons online, so it's pretty cool. And I've been doing it for 3 years now, and my very first student that I had was like the sweetest kind of soul in the world. She was in 8th grade auditioning for high schools and just practiced and worked so hard. And after a couple months of teaching her, I got an email out of the blue from her saying that we had to reschedule our lesson for that day because her dad had smashed her laptop with a hammer. And it was a huge shock to me, like, oh my gosh, I had no clue this like sweet girl is going through something like this. And I right away, like, I responded to her kindly and said, yes, no problem. And I reached out to the mom and just made sure everything was okay, and it was. But I think that's definitely a good point. And then my second point goes into a violin group class that I was teaching this year. This was a class of 8-year-olds, and there was one girl that I was told likely had a learning disability, but they weren't totally sure. And throughout the class, she'd kind of opened up to me a bit more about living with her grandpa, and she would always say, like, oh, I just want to see my mom. And at her first concert that we had, she wanted her mom to come, and her mom didn't come. And I kind of get into this later in the slides, how sometimes early on learning disabilities can be confused with traumatic experiences. So I thought that was definitely something important. And then just my own experiences. I won't get into too much of my life because it's private, but I have my own traumatic experiences and stuff that I've gone through. Especially this year, I've lost a lot of family and friends, and it's definitely hard. I'm sure we can all relate as being a college student, and then if anyone knows, having to go through stuff with family and friends while working really hard. So this is why I kind of got into this topic. And the research process was actually pretty good. There was lots of information out there about trauma and like psychology in general. And I got most of my sources from JSTOR and EBSCO. But what I was really happy about was that there were lots of music education based articles related to trauma. So exactly what I was researching was out there. So it was really great when I was doing this research. And then there was some stuff about music therapy that I kind of throw in at the end when I give some tips on how to incorporate mindfulness in the classroom. So this is our little agenda. First, we're going to define trauma because I think we need to get an idea of what exactly this means. And we'll talk about some types of trauma, signs that you can see of trauma in students in your classroom. And then the most important part, trauma-informed strategies that we can use in the classroom. And then at the end, I toss in some mindfulness strategies. So first, what is trauma? I got this definition from one of my articles, and it says trauma is an event, series of events, or a set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. Here I talk about types of trauma. So I took this little clip from one of my sources, and it talks about the different types of trauma on the left. And then as I'm naming these, you can kind of look and see what percentage most likely of boys or girls under 18 are likely to experience this, and then total in general. So some examples of this are going through a natural disaster, a serious accident or injury, robbery, physical abuse in the family or community, witnessing physical abuse in the family or community, sexual abuse, sexual assault, sudden or violent death of a close person, physical attack, witnessing a physical attack, a scary medical procedure, and experience of war. So this is what I found with my research, but to the side, I wanted to add these 3 couple things that I think are kind of left out. So first is gun violence, right? This is way more common nowadays. So I think this probably would have been added in the source a while ago. Foster care. I think that this is also something that's not really thought about as traumatic. Even if kids get a good placement, it's still pretty traumatic not being able to be with your family. And then emotional abuse, because I mean, this talks about physical abuse and sexual abuse, which is definitely significant as well. But I think emotional abuse is definitely not looked at as effective as it really is. It can have pretty lasting effects on people, and it's done so often through like just bullying or even by like a parent or a teacher that it's not really talked about much. So results of this was that girls reported significantly higher rates of sexual abuse, sexual assault, sudden or violent death of a close person, all complex post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms, depression, and dissociation than boys. So I think that's important, right, to look at these results and know that girls are more likely to experience this stuff. But I also wanted to bring up this point that I think relates to some of these results is the traditional masculinity ideology, which is what a man should be and how a man should act. It's the whole like man up, don't cry thing, because this is put on lots of younger boys too. And I think that this kind of suppresses some of these traumatic responses or even knowing sometimes what boys have gone through. Which leads to suppressing these emotions, like I talk about, and a lack of openness about mental health. And the thing about this with boys is that over time, it gets progressively worse. So you may not notice it when boys are younger, but as they age, this leads to anxiety, depression, stress, aggression, violence, alcohol, or drugs to try to block out feelings like they're told to do. So I still think that these results are important, right? And we should know that girls are more likely to experience this, but also be aware that this ideology, which is hopefully starting to go away as generations go on, still does exist. So signs of a traumatic reaction that you can look for in the classroom is being overly careful, thinking that they're a bad person, being in a persistent state of fear and readiness, difficulty regulating sleep or energy, dissociative freeze or surrender response when anxious, hyperarousal fight or flight response, hyperactivity, lots of energy, anxiety, impulsivity, and oversensitivity. I say this with little quotations because I still think that being oversensitive, if someone's acting sensitively to something, it's probably very valid to something that they have gone through. So now specifically, what you can look for is signs of a trauma reaction specifically in the classroom. So having bad dreams of what happened, trouble sleeping at night, right, can look like sleeping in class. Getting pictures in their head of what happened, which looks like zoning out. Trying not to think about it or have feelings about it, which can look like not opening up. Staying away from reminders, they could be refusing to do a specific activity. Acting out behavior or defiance, being extra jumpy, having trouble calming down when upset, feeling like a failure, refusing to move on to another task, so difficulty with transitions or change, trying to regain a sense of power over the teacher, not feeling close to other people, can't make many friends, panic attacks, learning disabilities or concentration issues, always a sense of current threat, dissociation, and shutting down. And then I write in the bottom here to the teacher, all of these things may appear as just ignoring or defying directions when it really could be, and most likely is, a sign of a trauma reaction. So when a student does not feel safe, their brain is in survival mode. And I can definitely account to this with my experiences with panic attacks. When you're in a heightened state of anxiety, it's very difficult to focus on what a parent is talking about or what a teacher or an adult is trying to explain to you, especially in the classroom when you're trying to learn. So as educators, we might never know whether or not a child has actually experienced trauma and should therefore assume that they have and respond sensitively, because maintaining a trauma-informed environment is beneficial for all students, but it's critical for those who have actually experienced trauma. So this is why it's definitely important to, as we get into these strategies, incorporate these in your classroom. Before we go into the strategies, here I have 4 different categories. So the first one is attachment. One is greet students daily by name, get to know your students, maintain consistency and predictability through routines, speak calmly and respectfully, give students choices, model respectful relationships, forgive, support, and believe in students, and maintain positive teacher-student relationships and repair when necessary. The second category is based on safety. Some of these are similar with the attachment one. So maintain an organized classroom, post a daily schedule, try to maintain consistent routines and procedures, warn students of any changes before they happen. For example, if you're going to have like a fire drill or something, you probably want to let the students know just in advance so it's not a scary all of a sudden thing that happens. Talk them through transitions, establish clear rules and consequences, be aware of student triggers and try your best to avoid them, and maintain a bully-free classroom and environment. Third category is discipline. So explain and discuss your expectations and consequences fairly early on if possible. Try to avoid calling out students if they're acting out in front of their peers because this can be seen as embarrassing in front of other students. Respond to dysregulated behavior in a calm way. I was actually just looking at this. I want to toss this in because I follow quite a few Instagram pages about like gentle parenting and teaching. And there was one teacher that posted that when she gets so overstimulated and when she feels like she's going to start yelling at her students, she sings what she's going to say. So she doesn't yell, but it helps her stay calm. So I haven't tried that yet, but it might be something to think about giving a try. So going forward, teaching coping strategies, set firm boundaries, connect negative teacher responses to the student's behavior, not to the student personally, and use discipline that teaches students better ways to manage stressful situations. So I did lots of reading about timeouts and how they have their pros and cons, but the more research that's being done on this, whether it's at home and a parent is like sending you to your room to think about what you did, or even in the classroom, if you're being put in a timeout, you're not being taught how to deal with those big emotions, and then it comes up later in life. So I think that timeouts are something to really think about how you're handling them. I'm not saying that they're totally a wrong thing. You just want to be very careful with how you approach that for students. And the fourth category is self-regulation. So help students identify and establish strategies to prevent their own dysregulation, increase student awareness of triggers and stress responses, offer sensory items. These can be like stress balls, fidget spinners, or flexible seating. Integrate social emotional learning, SEL activities, teach children about the brain's role in self-regulation, use literature, or in our case, music, to help recognize and identify emotions. And I'm skipping that one for a second. And then once again, maintain a bully-free classroom environment. For the Feelings Friday thing, I actually had a teacher in high school. I never had her as a teacher, but my family knew her outside of school. And she used to do something in her English class called Feelings Friday. And she would let people write down on a piece of paper something that they wanted to say or talk about or that they were going through. And then they would spend time at the end of class. She would just read them out loud and she would offer advice just to the whole class. So no one knew actually who wrote it. And she was just the kindest person in the world. And you'd see her standing outside her classroom in the hallway and she would always hug people she knew as they'd come by, or if you needed a hug, you just go right up to her and she would give you a hug. And it was sad, unfortunately, my senior year then of high school, she was diagnosed with cancer and she passed away just within a couple months. And it was definitely an empty space in the school without her there always giving her hugs in the hallway. But I will always take that with me, even though I never had her as a teacher, and probably incorporate that in my classroom in the future. So music can be used to express dissatisfaction with today's world, hope for better things, remembrance of nostalgic memories. And it's important to understand what songs express and become more sensitive to the needs of those people who are struggling. So having trauma-informed teaching strategies is important, but especially in the music classroom, this is a really great place to incorporate those. And then these are just a couple mindfulness things that I read about in some of my music therapy specific articles that you can try to incorporate at the beginning of classes or at the end of classes. This can be stuff with muscle relaxation, deep breathing, doing visualization, and listening to sounds. I'm curious, in high school, has anyone ever had a teacher, you can just show by your hand, incorporate any of these things, like at the beginning of class or end of class? 1, 2, 3, just about 3. Okay. I had one teacher as well, and he would just do it a couple of times. And I think it's something that should be recognized a little bit further because it does have such a great impact, especially in how we start the day too, or start class. So that's a lot of stuff I just talked about. And I know that to me, like I did all my research on this, and to you guys, this is just like a 20-minute presentation. So these are the 3 takeaways I would say just to remember as we go forward. One is have a repertoire of methods, right? So I showed probably like 20 different things on here. So take away what you can out of a couple of those things and have things prepared for your classroom that you can use with these strategies. 2, just knowing that learning disability diagnoses are common, like I talked about with my group class violin student. I'll never know if she actually had a learning disability or if it was just trauma or maybe it was both. But it's a very common thing, and I think we should just be very aware of that. And then 3, when we have modifications or accommodations, we should definitely be incorporating those. I know some people, there's talk about how those aren't really the best way to go because then the student's not following the system and all this. But the goal for students is that they learn. That's the bottom line. And one of the things, I have a podcast I would do with my friend, and whenever we talk about stuff like this, we would always say the system, like this learning system, is constructed, therefore it can be deconstructed for the student. And these are my sources.
Before you go down, can you answer questions?
Oh, yeah.
Can you go on the camera and answer questions?
Yes.
Okay. Any questions for Emily?
I have a question. Many U.S. public schools don't fund mental health programs. So if you were in the case of going into a school where the rate of mental health was on the more severe side, and you know we can't as teachers be therapists for everyone, and everyone has some type of issue mentally. What would you want to advocate for a program like that, or is there an alternative you think you could do as a teacher, seeing that there's this type of issue in some of these students?
Yeah, I would really incorporate probably funding and more attention towards the music education program specifically in that school. Because I think people prioritize a lot of making sure, especially if students are having mental health issues, it's like, okay, they're dealing with a lot. Let's make sure that they just do well enough in math and they do well enough in English, and so that they can pass. But I think it's important that we also recognize how music and some of those more enjoyable and relaxing classes can help students open up and deal with mental health issues like that. So that's definitely what I would advocate in a school like that, more basically for my program, but for good reasons. Yeah.
So you had, when talking about timeouts and things like that, you had mentioned that research shows there's pros and cons to both. And you mentioned that the con would be that children don't really they don't develop the ways to deal with emotions. So I wonder what the pros would be, like either with your personal opinion or what the research said.
Yeah. Unfortunately, the only pros really to that is it's a quick and easy fix. So if you have a classroom of like 24 students and you're having one acting out, it's very simple to just have your timeout corner, and you explain this to them like early on so they understand what to do. And they go over to it and they sit there for their 3-5 minutes or so, and then they come back with the class. It's a quick fix and it works in the short term if you're trying to work with all these students. But the issue is that then you're also sacrificing that in the long term. They're not learning how to work with those emotions, especially because it's very likely that the parents are doing this at home too. When they get really overstimulated, it's okay, go to your room, think about what you did. And then they're just worked up and they don't understand how to process this and how to calm down. So I think, in a perfect world, there would be like 2 teachers in every classroom. And you'd have one handling the group. And then if something like that happens, you would have the other one take that student out, help them process through things, deep breathing, show them how to calm themselves down, and then come back in. But unfortunately, that's not how things are at the moment. Yeah.
Oh, do you mind if I piggyback?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Because one thing that I've read in terms of Jordan's question is a recommendation is to follow a timeout with a time in, which is just the label for. The timeout is sort of the cooling off period, and then the time in is when you actually sit down and talk to the student and say, well, why did we get so upset about this? And how do we problem solve this? And how do we deal with our emotions? And actually trying to deal with the knotty emotional issues that are coming up as a result of that. So obviously if you have 2 teachers, like you said, then that teacher can deal with the time in, but that's just a strategy that I've read about before.
Yeah, that's definitely good, for sure. Something to do.
Any questions? Okay. Thank you, Emily.